Welcome back to our discussion of Chapter 7. So, we've talked a little bit about cash so far, in that it's considered as part of the most liquid assets that a company can have. So, first we want to define cash. So, we know cash to be the money in a company's bank account. But when you see the cash listed on a company's balance sheet, it can also include things like checks, money orders, traveler's checks, and bank card sales. All of those are still considered to be part of cash. So whenever we look at a transaction, for example, where a customer provides us with a check in payment of an order, we just add that into cash. We accept that as cash, although we might have to wait, a day or two for that check to clear the bank. Now on the balance sheet, you won't just see cash listed there, but you'll also see cash equivalents on a company's balance sheet. So those are items that are so liquid and so safe that they're considered to be very close and basically equal to cash. So for something to be considered a cash equivalent, it needs to, first of all, be very safe, and it has to have a stable market value, and it has to have a maturity date that is no more than 90 days from the initial date. So it's something that's going to mature within 90 days or less. So examples of cash equivalents would be money market funds, U.S. Treasury bills, and high-grade commercial paper. So anything that is really safe and liquid and has a stable market value and is going to mature within 90 days or less, all of those can then be considered to be cash equivalents. These examples we have down below. So if we're looking at something that qualifies or checks off these three standards here, it can be considered to be a cash equivalent. Now, what about restricted cash? So restricted cash is cash that is set aside for a specific purpose. It cannot be used for operations to pay operational bills like the utility bill or to pay salaries. Restricted cash is cash that is set aside. So an example would be if a company sets aside cash to pay off a specific liability. So if they have a specific, let's say a loan from the bank, for example, that they want to make sure that they always have enough money to pay that loan off as those payments are becoming due, a company might set aside cash within the restricted cash account so that that cash is not touched on accident. So this is much more than just having a cash buffer in your regular cash account. This is cash that is labeled as do not touch, so to speak, so that it's not used for day-to-day expenses and cash needs for cash outflows, but rather it's set aside so a company makes sure, okay, this cash that we're setting aside here is only to be used for X, Y, and Z. So on the balance sheet, you will see restricted cash, not part of cash, but restricted cash because we're restricting it aside from our other cash. It'll be listed under the section titled Investments and Restricted Funds. So because it's restricted, we don't want to include that as part of our overall cash account because that might mislead an external user. We want to show, okay, here's our cash, but we also restricted a certain amount of cash that's not included in the cash account. Here it is listed under that restricted section. So investments and restricted funds. Okay, so it's not that it's not part of our bank account, but on the books, we're not going to include restricted cash as part of our cash account, although it might be mixed in, obviously, on the bank account of the company. But also many companies have several bank accounts. Not all companies will just have one or two. So a company might decide to have a separate bank account just for restricted cash. So that's possible. Next is lines of credit. So this is when a bank agrees in advance to loan a company some money up to a certain amount. So if you have a line of credit with your bank, you can borrow money from the bank at any time. So, but as soon as you use a portion of that line of credit, so let's say your line of credit is $10,000. So as soon as you use $2,000 of that $10,000 line of credit, a liability has been created. And then on the books, you have to create or record the fact that, okay, now I have created a payable. I now owe my bank $2,000 that I didn't owe before. All right, cash management. So cash management, just overall, it refers to planning, controlling, and accounting for cash transactions and balances. So it's really intuitive. The way that it's named is very intuitive. It's cash management. So being able to manage your cash effectively, and that will include things like planning, controlling, and accounting for everything cash. So the main objectives of cash management would be providing accurate accounting for cash receipts, so cash coming in, cash disbursements, cash going out, and cash balances. Another objective of cash management is to prevent and minimize loss from things like theft and fraud. And also, cash management, another main purpose of it is to anticipate how much a company is going to need to borrow to ensure that there is enough cash in the bank available to conduct operations, to pay the bills. So if a company doesn't manage its cash well, it might not realize that in a week or so, its cash balance is not going to be enough to keep operations going. So if a company has good cash management in place, it will be able to look ahead and say, okay, operationally, we have these expenses that, these cash expenses coming down the pipeline pretty soon. Currently, we're not going to have enough cash to fulfill those obligations, so we need to go to the bank and ask for a loan of X amount of dollars to just make sure we have enough cash in the bank to keep operations going. And another main thing about cash management that we've touched on lightly is one main objective is to prevent unnecessarily large amounts of cash just sitting around, being unproductive and not generating revenue. So we talked about the fact that if a company makes sure that it has enough cash to keep operations going, but it has a lot of excess cash beyond that, a part of effective cash management is being able to take that excess cash and invest it so that that cash can produce revenue into the future. So a part of effective cash management isn't just making sure that you have enough cash to keep the wheels spinning, but it's also a large part of cash management is making sure that any large amounts of excess cash is put to good use and not just sitting there in a bank account. Because it's one thing if your bank account is interest bearing, but usually the interest that you are able to earn in a savings account at your bank is not nearly as much as what you can earn by investing that cash in other ways. So that's cash management in a nutshell. So part of cash management, we can all agree that part of effective cash management will include internal control over our cash. That's very important. And internal control over cash is going to help with fraud prevention, making sure there's no fraud happening, no theft happening, and if it does happen, that we can catch that. Because internal control is not just about not having fraud or theft happen, but also making sure that if that actually occurs, that is detected in time. In a perfect world, there is no fraud and no theft that happens within a business. If you have good internal control, you can come pretty close to that, but it's just important to note that in the event that it happens, a good internal control structure will allow the company to know that something has happened. If you have no internal control or there is poor internal control, fraud can be happening and theft can be happening, but it just won't be detected. And internal control also helps with efficient cash management like we talked about above, and it helps with accurate accounting for transactions and anticipating the need for borrowing, which we also talked about. And it helps to maintain adequate but not excessive cash balances. So really, cash management and internal control over cash really go hand in hand. But a strong internal control structure, specifically internal control over cash, really helps with cash management at the end of the day, because it helps with that controlling aspect of cash management. So just one little example of good internal control is, for example, a company wouldn't want the person receiving checks from customers to be the same person making the journal entry, and wouldn't want that also to be the same person taking those checks to the bank to be deposited, because that would leave a lot of room for things to go wrong. Ideally, for example, the person receiving checks from customers dealing with those things should not be the same person that then journalizes those transactions. And ideally, there should be then a separate person that runs checks to the bank and makes those deposits. Those kinds of tasks should be their own responsibilities on their own, and no one person should have access to all those different things within a business. That helps with internal control and minimizes the chance of fraud occurring. Okay, next is cash over and cash short. So a lot of you might have experience with this if you've worked a register before, or if you own your own business. At the end of business on each day, a company, especially companies that are working with cash transactions on a daily basis, they want to reconcile the actual cash in the registers with what we have on the record in terms of transactions that happened that day. So according to the records, how much cash should there be? And then according to the register, how much physical cash is there actually? So at the end of the day, if a company's physical cash is less than what the records say it should be, the company is short, cash short. If the physical cash, on the other hand, is more than what the records say it should be, then the company is over for whatever reason. That might be incorrect change was handed to a customer or something like that. So we have to record anytime that the cash is over or there's a cash shortage. So for this purpose, we would use the account titled cash over and short. That's how we record these kinds of instances. So as an example, assume that total cash sales were $4,500. So that's how much cash we should have on hand, but cash in the drawer only totals $4,485. So we can see here we are $15 short in terms of cash. So we actually now have to properly adjust cash for this, because especially if we have a perpetual inventory system and a sophisticated inventory or accounting software, when sales are made, accounts are updated within the system. So our cash account for, let's say this was for a particular day, the cash account thinks there's $4,500 cash, but in reality, there's only $4,485, so we need to adjust the cash account balance to reflect how much cash is actually on hand. So to record this, we would credit cash. So we'll do this first. It helps us to figure out what the other half would be. So I would have to credit cash for $15. So that would mean I would have to debit the cash over and short account. I would debit that account for $15. And this cash over and short account is considered an expense account. Okay, so if the opposite were to happen, where I had more cash on hand than what the sales show, I would debit cash instead and credit the cash over and short account. Okay, that is that for this video. Continue watching for a continued discussion of the chapter.